I went in to see the teacher, and he asked me who I was. And he said, "Who are you? And where do you come from?" And I said, "My name's John. I come from Australia." And he said, "No." And he just looked at me again and said, "Who are you?" And I knew he did. And he had a stick and he raised it to about to hit me. And I thought, oh, he doesn't mean where I come from Australia. He means, who am I really? And something came out of me because I was deep in the meditation. I roared at him. I just yelled, "Ha!" like that. And it made him really happy. So I could tell he'd experienced this before.
John Tarrant is a teacher of Zen and an author of several powerful books, including The Light Inside the Dark, The Story of the Buddha, and Bring Me the Rhinoceros, a book which found me at a time when I needed it the most. It grounded my outlook on life and centered my perspective towards the present moment. Originally from Tasmania, John's life is rich with stories and deep wisdom. I'm very grateful for John's time and for the conversation. And as always, be sure to like this episode, let me know what you think of it, and consider subscribing to the podcast. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you being here. We've been going back and forth via email for a little while now, so I'm very glad that we have the time to meet here. So it's a great opportunity.
Excellent. I'm glad to be here. I just got back from Kyoto, actually, and sort of just slotted in that we met.
It seems like you're traveling a lot. Do you do that just for pleasure, for work?
I actually don't travel that much, but I don't know. Depends what you call. I teach usually, and there I was meeting people. I was meeting people who teach and connections I have in the Zen world over there and things like that.
How are you doing today?
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm happy. It's sort of we're waiting for it. We're very affected by the weather in California, whether it's going to have fire or flood or earthquake. But today we're just waiting, and it's been very wet. It's cool and overcast and really sweet, and so I don't know. I feel happy. Yeah, it's nice to be. I love life, and I love just being here, wherever here is. So that's how I'm doing. Really,
that's fantastic. Yeah. And I just wanted to briefly mention how I first learned about you, specifically through, I found this book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, your book that you wrote, and it found me at a time in life that I really think there was a nice synchronicity going on there. During the pandemic, I basically got hit with a kind of I guess they call it the quarter life crisis, where I saw that there was a lot of, obviously the questions of mortality were very clear and present. People all around us were getting sick and dying. And it really concerned me because I was just getting started with my life, getting out of school, finding a job, getting an apartment and everything. And I guess I got hit with the realization. I guess everyone understands that they're going to die at some point, but it really felt visceral during the pandemic. And so I found your book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, and I have to say that all those feelings of anxiety and panic, they were able to be subsided as much as they can just through reading your work, because I understood by you bringing these Zen koans, they made me realize how everything is fleeting and temporary, but in a not necessarily a good or a bad way, but just that's what it is. So I resonated with that, and I did feel a sense of bliss, and really was able to pull myself as much as I could out of this state of anxiety and nerves and panic. And so I just want to thank you very much for putting that work together. It's a beautiful, beautiful text. You're bringing that wisdom. You're putting it together in your own special way, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. Touch, Joe. I'm glad. One of the nice things about writing is you get to meet interesting people. So, but But yeah, that's what it was for. It was a sort of book to, I suppose, a gateway for alleviating anxiety and things like that. Not to get rid of it completely or sorrow, but in a way to be free inside it.
Have you ever found yourself struggling with anxiety at all during your life?
Yeah, I guess that's why I took up Zen, because I was kind of, I don't know, I was kind of depressed, and I was actually working in Australia. I was living in Australia, and I was working for Aboriginal land rights in Australia, in First Peoples land rights, and which seemed like a good cause, and kind of was, I guess, and in the capital in Canberra. And then I realized that everybody was always, it's kind of obvious, but everybody was always fighting each other, as people do in movements, and I really liked the people and all. And then I realized, at some stage, I realized two things. One is, in order to survive, I had to have a practice. And I noticed if I meditated, my day went a lot better. And I was in a lot of tangles with people. And if other people were entangled, it was all right. I was okay with them. I wasn't judging them or afraid or things like that. And so then I don't know, I was doing some martial arts at the time, and that seemed to help. The meditation helped. It was really the concentration of the martial arts that helped, really. And then I don't know, I just went off to study Zen for a few months and just never went back. Kept studying it. So I got into the koans and that whole thing. And it was sort of a great thing. It's not that it stopped me from ever having tangles or troubles, but I was on the journey and on a path. To have a path is a great thing, I think, practice.
So what started you on that path? I know you just explained like a little bit of the background there, but can you just tell me a little bit about where you come from? I know you're from Tasmania. Okay, how does your background work into your spiritual journey?
Well, Tasmania is a funny kind of place. It's sort of full of people who, I don't know, really stuck there. It was settled by, it was settled by people who were convicted of who were basically poor and convicted of stealing food or something in London or Ireland, and they were sent out in chains to Tasmania, and then they were released pretty soon if they were still alive, because nobody wanted to keep control of them. And my family, as the joke goes, my family was selected by the best judges of England, and so and so it was a funny kind of place, and in a way, I think you had to think about what life was really about, and you didn't have to, but that seemed like to be a good thing, and so I did that, and I really studied poetry and things like that, and that seemed to help. It seemed to be in the right direction, and going into Chinese poetry, and that seemed to be in the right direction, but it wasn't a very spiritual place, and I wasn't a very spiritual kind of person. And so, I didn't like people telling me things to believe, and I thought that maybe that's what spirituality was. And then later on I found out that's the opposite of Zen. It's being here and finding out what it is to truly live your life and to jump into your life, So I got out of Tasmania, and although I didn't have to, but in those days there wasn't anything there that would help me. And so I just went all over the place and did a lot of different things. Worked in the smelters, and worked on fishing fleet in Northern Australia and things. And eventually I thought, I better get an inner life. That would be a good idea. So get a clue kind of thing. Yeah. So I did that, and then I first studied with the Tibetans in Australia. They were the only Buddhists who came through, and I didn't really know anything about Buddhism, so it didn't really matter who I studied with, but I was working in a publishing house and kind of copy editing and things, and that was kind of cool. But I just ran into somebody I hardly knew. I just recognized on the street. We recognized each other, and she was working on a different floor, more senior editor. And she And what are you up to? And she said, well, I'm going on a retreat, a month-long retreat with the Tibetans. And I said, oh, and what's that about? And she didn't really tell me very much, except that you meditated and they taught. And I knew nothing about Buddhism, Tibetans, any of that. And I said, how can I get hold of them? So, it's one of those things where the universe just snatches you. And I didn't have any questions, so I called them up, and I didn't get any. I didn't listen. They had an introduction, so you'd survive the course, but I didn't take it. And I wondered later why, and I probably was frightened that I probably was afraid it would frighten me off. So if I knew what I was getting into. So I just dived in without knowing, but it was great. I came back really transformed, and just through beginning it in a life. But it also, I read things and talked to the lamas and people, and then it turned out, Zen was my more my thing, because you could live inside life very much with Zen. It didn't matter whether you were, a filing clerk or a company director, digging in the roads, or whatever you were. You could be, or drag queen for that matter. You could be what you were, but you had to in a way put up with survive yourself, be true to yourself. So that was kind of great, and then that was obviously a practice, because you can't just think, oh, that's what I'll do. I'll be myself, because you have to, in a way, learn how to deal with the cross currents inside and the busyness of the monkey mind, all that sort of thing, and set your mind to rest, your heart to rest. Yeah. So here I am after all these years. Yeah.
So that must have been around the 60s and the 70s, right?
Yeah. It was in the mid 70s. Yeah.
So that was kind of a interesting time to be alive, right? To be around and feel like all these ideas. I mean, Buddhism coming into the Western world, it had only been really discussed and around for only a few decades at that point, really. I mean, there were people, if you go to the United States, the Transcendentalists obviously were exploring Buddhism back in the mid 1800s as well. But there really wasn't the doors weren't open, I guess, to the Western world as of yet. So it was interesting how in the 60s and the 70s, you're really the first generation of this, I think, a Western group to largely adopt Buddhism and Zen in particular. How was it like during that time, seeing all of these teachings, whether it be Buddhism, Hinduism, the teachings of the East, come into the West?
Well, it was one of those currents in the universe. You get these currents in the universe, and nobody thinks they're part of a current in the universe. And you look around, and all these other people are doing the same thing. My history with my teacher was interesting, because he was taken prisoner. He was a civilian prisoner in the Second World War. He was a civilian worker in Guam, and when the Japanese just invaded and took Guam and marched everybody off to Japan, and the Japanese treated the military people terribly, and they killed them or worked them to death or something. But the civilian people, they treated about as well as their own civilians. It wasn't that great, but they, as long as you kept in line and didn't, create troubles, you were going to be okay. And so in Japan, in one of the camps, he met a famous translator, a guy called Reginald Blythe, who was there translating him, was quite happily set up in a camp, speaking good Japanese and translating. And he was a great translator of the great haiku poets. And his translations are still worth finding. And the guy who taught me, his name was Robert Aitken. And so Blythe said, well, you better learn to meditate to help survive the prison camp. And so he did. And, he said, I was just leaning up. I wasn't very formal. I was just leaning up against a pillar. And he taught him how to meditate, just count your breaths, things like that, And then he taught him about koans. And so what is Buddha? 3 pounds of flax and things like that. That didn't make any sense. And that was I think he later learned that the way that koans don't make sense was, interrupting your mind so that they did something else. Something else was going to happen to your mind. Your mind had to go to a different place than working everything out. And so when he got out of the camp, he was incredibly grateful to Mr. Blythe, as he always called him in this old-fashioned way. And he set up eventually, and he studied with various people. He studied with Krishnamurti and these old names of people from long ago. And there were a couple of Japanese people came to California for a different reason. There was a guy called Nyogen Senzaki who came and worked in the strawberry fields in California. And he was a Zen monk who left. He was opposed to the Japanese warmongering. His teacher, and vocally opposed. So his teacher sent him out for the good of his health. His teacher sent him to California. And so he was one of the first major Zen teachers in the United States. And that was, and so he was in a prison camp. We had internment camps, and there was a camp in Idaho. It's the only Zen center during the Second World War was a prison camp in Idaho. So, and I occasionally met. I had a friend who was a Japanese guy who was just a little kid there, and told me stories about that. So that was a sort of lineage was assembling itself, and then other people went to Japan to study poets and people like that, and the Beats got into it and things like that. But so there was a kind of a tradition. But anyway, I went and studied with him, and it was the same thing. You just sit in the zendo and you don't get very much help with it. Just sit there, sit still and shut up and be happy kind of thing. and have a koan, And so you sit there and you think, I don't know, this isn't making much sense. And don't hang in there. And you could tell that the great old masters were onto something. That was the thing. But I didn't know what it was. But I also thought, well, I don't know. What choice do I have? None of the things that make sense have really worked for me. So I'll try something that doesn't really make sense. And I like poetry, so I was used to things touching your heart without making sense in an obvious way.
Was there a moment when, a moment where things began to click, when you were really affected by the Zen teaching? Maybe a specific koan that really affected you?
I think it was all unconscious at first, and like my meeting this woman and she's saying, oh, I'm just studying with these Tibetans. And I said, where can you get hold of them? And I had no idea what I was doing or why, but it seemed important, that sort of thing. So at first it was like that. And I went to study, and there was this sort of Japanese zendo set up in Hawaii on Maui. And we would work, it was pretty much like a monastery, although, the crazy hippies and drug dealers and people were there, and famous Pulitzer Prize winning poets and things like that. It was a very motley crew, and me and other Australians and things. And I realized at some stage I just didn't know what I was doing. It was very painful, and sitting still. I couldn't sit still. My mind was hyperactive. That was all that stuff, and so I don't know, but somehow I'd hear the talks and about the stories, and somehow it didn't really make sense, but I thought I was in the right place. So I just stayed with that for, I don't know, about the first year. It didn't make much sense, but I could tell something was changing, and I had dreams. And haiku had that way of, just like a koan, of like just touching you, old pond frog junks in splash, that sort of thing, or winter morning, sparrows sitting together without any necks, that kind of thing. And so there's just moments of life that seem somehow illuminated. And so there was that side of it. And then I don't know, I just kept working, and it was very, very hard for me. And I'd come out of this world that this kind of the First People's activism was pretty tough. People would meet in the pub and get into fights and things, and also then I'd been in the smelters and the fishing fleets, and so it was a kind of rough world. And I would think, I'll just sit through this next period before I punch the wall out in front of me. So there was this way in which And I knew I wasn't going to, but there's this sort of way of intense. And I knew that what I was doing was working with the koans, and the practice was working with me. And I just it was okay to bear that, And so I did. And then eventually I got happy, and I noticed I had dreams. I dreamed that the deity of mercy, and it was called Kuan Yin or Kanon in Japanese, and is their version of the Virgin Mary, actually, or Isis, and she came down to me and told me it was going to be all right and things, but in a dream, and so then I had dreams, other dreams it was going to be all right, and I knew it was going to be all right, and so I went into a big retreat and there was a famous Japanese teacher there teaching, and I thought, this will be it. And I rushed in all eager for him. I'm sure he would say a turning word. And he just looked at me. He could see how eager I was and things like that. And he just smiled and told me the most beginning practice. And so I realized that I had to just somehow do it myself. And then when you put yourself in a way like that, gradually, if you don't blame other people and you don't, all that sort of thing, it gradually, I started to settle, and I could tell my mind was different, and I could pay attention a lot more, and I wasn't unhappy with it. The dishes started to seem wonderful, and gardening seemed wonderful, things like that. And I realized if I never had some great awakening, it was going to be all right. I could be a gardener in the temple for the rest of my life or something. And then one time I just had I don't know, I was just sitting in a long, hot afternoon, and everybody was sitting there suffering and squirming and in the zendo, and I just was completely happy, and I realized, this is kind of it, and I just became full of joy. There's like something switches. Before that, I'm the sort of person who believes in second opinions and medicine and Zen. So I had gone off there's a famous Korean teacher, and I'd gone off to visit him for a very short retreat in New York. And Korean teacher, and I just sat there, and it was this kind of, none of the Japanese beautiful experience, the aesthetic experience of the Japanese. He's Korean. No, it's concrete blocks. You're looking at concrete blocks, cold, hard floor, a basement, and thin pads, and so your knees are hurting, you're cold because it's like late autumn in New York, and they're not really heating it. And I just was looking at the country and avoiding the thought that incredibly ugly environment I'm in, and realizing it's not. And then suddenly I just found the concrete blocks really beautiful. And I went in to see the teacher, and he asked me who I was, and he said, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" And I said, "My name's John. I come from Australia." And he said, "No," and he just looked at me again and said, "Who are you?" And I knew he did, and he had a stick and he raised it to about to hit me, and I thought, oh, he doesn't mean where I come from Australia. He means who am I really? And there's something came out of me because I was deep in the meditation. I roared at him. I just yelled, "Ha!" like that. And it made him really happy. So I could tell he'd experienced this before. And he even he said, "Don't break my glass. Don't get so excited that you break my glass." So that was fun. And then I liked him. And so he would give me koans, and I'd hoss around with them. And he suggested I come off to travel. He was always on the road, traveling monk kind of person. And he was great, but I just knew there was something for me in the very orderly Japanese style of, 1,000 koans kind of thing. And so I went back, but then after that, the time I took to where sitting all night, I spoke to you about, I knew I'd gotten something, and I could answer some koans, but there was some deeper, great overturning needed to happen. So I went back, and one afternoon it happened, and I was happy very happy. It's hard not to laugh, and I could answer koans and things like that. So, the koans, not that they made sense, they're not supposed to do that, but you can dance with them. You can feel, people have a curriculum and things like that. So it was great. So that was that. And then after that, you have to work out, well, what do I do with that? Whole system is worked out for monks and to some degree nuns, but mainly for monks. And then I had to work out, well, hang on, I'm not really a monk, and that's not my personality really, and stuff like that. And so then we had to work that out. And I ended up going to, so I finished, became a teacher and finished their curriculum, which was, lots and lots and lots of koans, and ran the Zendo for a while and things like that. And that was great. But I could tell there was stuff about how do I apply this to everyday life that you couldn't learn from Japan. So although you can learn a lot from the Japanese. And so then I got into that, and I studied all these different things. I studied dream work and all kinds of psychotherapy, got a PhD in psychotherapy and stuff. But I wasn't trying to, most people are coming the other way. Like there's a guy called Mark Epstein who lives near you, actually, in Woodstock, I think. And he's a kind of smart, interesting guy. And I don't know. Anyway, he and I were talking just recently, and he was a shrink. He was a psychotherapist and an MD who got very into meditation, mindfulness, and stuff, and he was sort of interested in what I was doing because it was much stranger and crazier than mindfulness, and so we talked, and then he took a big piece of rhinoceros, basically, all the ideas, meeting the inconceivable, and he put that in his latest book. But as a result, I said, well, you better blurb mine then. So I got into blurb my latest book. But and so he was coming that way. There was a lot of people went into psychotherapy and decided to come back. And they got into intricately watching the movements of the mind, But I actually was a Zen person. I got into the sort of the pure entering reality. And then I went into psychotherapy to understand how to apply that. But I was really a Zen person studying psychotherapy rather than psychotherapist studying Zen. And I think there's a difference. So there's the long story.
I'm curious. So with psychotherapy, you're talking about dream analysis.
Right.
Were you inspired? You said that you spent time with the Aboriginals. I know that in their foundational myths, the idea of dream time is very important to them and into their worldview. Did you incorporate that understanding of dream time into your dream analysis in your work?
Well, there's a tremendous, everybody knows, and among First Peoples, probably in the United States too, I think, there's a tremendous wisdom about not making up reality and really being touched by the great deep forces, and, myths and so on. But actually, I went and did, and I was close to those people, but there was a certain stage, and I felt like they cared about nature a lot, and they were kind of happy in spite of being badly treated, and so I thought they got points for that, but I also thought, in a way that was their world and I could help, so I did lobbying in Parliament for them, things like that. But there was a certain stage in which, I don't know, I felt like as somebody who was white and a little bit, it was hard to deeply understand. People offered that to me. They'd come and live with us and would give you the shamanic training and all that sort of thing. But I don't know. It didn't feel like it was kind to them somehow to do that. And so I did my Jungian dream training where, dreams are interesting because they don't make any sense really. And you can say they make sense, but they don't. and so then you have this great thing where they're like koans, and so they touch some deep thing, and they're related to, I suppose, Taoism Zen, what's different about Zen from the other kinds of Buddhism is that it mixed up with Taoism, and that sense of being in the flow of things, and clouds and wind and clouds and water, and that's one of the Zen ways to be, clouds and water, and we just flow along. So I felt like the dreams were, and I teach my, I'm old enough now to have trained some teachers and learn what I think is important to teach people, and so, and gradually, the thing about teaching teachers is that you learn a lot yourself, So I've taught them to get people to tell you their dreams sometimes, because dreams will tell you when you're going to wake. Are you very far from awakening or not? I had a guy had a dream where he was on top of a hill and he was digging down, which in a way is kind of marvelous, but you could tell that, I don't know, whatever he's doing with his practice, he's not actually free, it's too tight, and he's working too hard. And so a lot of it is to get where people work hard, but not too hard on spiritual practice. So not take yourself too seriously, So I think that's part of it. Don't take yourself too seriously.
What's interesting is, especially in your book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, at the very end, obviously discuss many Zen koans throughout the book. That's what the book is. But at the very end, you have one that is a Aboriginal, Australian, purely original koan. So I find it interesting. You're talking about dreams right now. We talked about, dream time, the Aboriginal thought as well. It's interesting how koans are essentially just like almost like a little nugget of truth, right? And you can find that throughout world cultures, throughout the globe. Do you see any other cultures or any other stories that stick out to you that are similar to the koans, the Zen koans, but are found in other cultures around the world?
You have good questions. That's such a great question. There was a great Italian writer called Roberto Calasso who influenced me to some extent in my approach. I mean, I'd already was a Zen teacher and all by then, but he said that our European stories and other cultural stories are really, they often touch in a way on consciousness and the transformation of consciousness. But if you have to go east to India and particularly China and Japan to really get stories that are about the transformation of consciousness, and people really think about that a lot. And for some weird reason, the Chinese just really thought about that. The Indians did too. And so you'll find some of those stories in I'm not as well versed with the Indian stories as I am with the Chinese and Japanese, but you'll find it there. But then we also, as part of our trying to integrate things, we'll tell we'll tell stories to people. We'll tell stories that might be from any culture. There might be a Haida story from the Pacific Northwest, or it might be. I mean, we've developed a few, like the myth of Psyche and Eros, which is a Greek story, and there's a Russian fairy tale, Vasilisa the Beautiful, that we use, and we can tell it. They really touch on the ways we imprison ourselves and get stuck with the old witch in our consciousness and things like that. And they're really not always about awakening, but they're a way. How can you integrate your awakening? I would say that you can wake up, but then, I don't know, maybe you still can't listen to your kids, something like that, or maybe, you have a lover, but you don't listen to them, or something like that. Or you have to take refuge in how pure and correct you are, or something like that. And so the myths have a beautiful, they make things thicker and denser in a positive way. They make your life richer. So we do a special kind of retreat where we'll both do koans and a lot of meditation, but also tell a story and say, well, what touches you in that story? And I wrote this story of the Buddha book out of like telling the Buddha's story. Well, what touches you? And the Buddha's story is a kind of weird story if you think about it. And but then what touches you? What's deep in human consciousness about that story that touches you and for your life? Or like in the Rhinoceros book, the koan, it sounds like the Maralung koan, which was about, do you mind if I tell that story a little bit?
Please, yeah, definitely.
So I had a student who was an ethnomusicologist and was up in the Northern Territory. And so he's interested in singers and songwriters and stuff. And he spoke a local language, one of the local languages, but mainly things were done in Pidgin, which is somewhere kind of sort of, it's easy to pick up and because it's sort of halfway between the languages. And so anyway, he had met this guy called Maralung, and and it's this great story where Maralung was this famous songwriter, and he'd just go around these places really out in the bush, and there'd be like a river crossing or something, and he'd have a troupe of dancers with him, and they'd just arrive there and set up camp. And in the Australian First Peoples custom, you notice people have arrived, and then you let them settle in for a couple of days and see what they want to be up to and stuff, and then you go and meet them and feed them and things. So he did, and so he would have a dance troupe, and he'd tell stories and have songs that he would tell, and then one night he dreamed of this song. Basically, it's a beautiful story because he dreamed that there are these mysterious lights you get up in the bush called Min Min lights, is the local name for them, and nobody really knows what they are, but they're a real thing. And this Min Min lights were blue and green and white, and they were streaming down. And then in his dream, this ancient songman everybody knew he had existed, but nobody could remember him. He'd probably a couple 100 years ago or something. And he and a bird, he had a friend who was a bird, set off out in the dream after the Min Min lights, and he went there. And Min Min lights are considered dangerous, but they're part of the dream time. And you can get songs there. And so he got a song, and then the old Balangiri was the name of the old songwriter, and he came into the camp. And in the way Maralung told the story, he woke him up. He's sleeping. He's having a dream about this guy, and suddenly the guy arrives there, and he wakes him up. He says, "I've got a song to tell you." And he sings the song, and the bird sings it too, and they're happy. And he says, "So try to remember this. I put this song for you." And I'm like, yeah, but then, silly me, I fell asleep and all that. And I forgot. And then yes, my friend there, "You forgot?" He's got his tape recorder there. He wants all that sort of thing. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, 1 time, 2 times, 7 times, 9 times. He'll sing it for me and I'll remember." So there's a very wonderful, free attitude towards the creative process. And then the next night, the ancient songman came into his dream, woke him up, taught him the song again, and then and this time he remembered. So there's a wonderful story about how we drift in between. The dead help us, and the dreams help us. And he was a smart guy, the songman, his name, and Maralung, and a thoughtful, smart person. So he wasn't just deluded. And also the song was to make it even more koan-like and strange, the song was in a language that only the ghosts could understand. So anyway, I thought that was a rather wonderful thing. So that's one of the things we have people sit with sometimes, because everybody's got their ghosts who tell them things. And stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, what's so interesting about that is once I finished your book, I immediately went on Spotify. I went online and I looked up the song, and I was like, I need to listen to this. And I definitely got the impression of ghosts, so almost like a very haunting kind of feeling. But it definitely surely brings you into the present moment for sure. But it does have that sense of like it's being pulled from the ancestral depths. It's coming from some very ancient place,
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is that Marylong himself, he didn't understand it either. So there was this. I thought that was kind of powerful because we can work with the great forces and they can help us, but we don't have to understand them and bring them into the day mind. We can keep them in the deep world of where the images and poetry and things come from.
So you ended up you became a psychoanalyst. What inspired you down that path? Was it particularly, you've obviously have this interest in myths, the koans, bringing this all together, were you trying to understand it in more of a methodical way? You're talking about Carl Jung.
Yeah, I was trying to bring it together, and I also felt like, I felt like I was really a Zen person, not a psychotherapist really, but psychotherapy is really interesting, and I tried different, and I met a lot of great psychotherapists of the time and people doing family therapy, and family therapy is weird, some, weird things happen when you do it. Like there's a magic in how people are together. I remember being in Hawaii with some family and there was this kid who was just acting out terribly. And I said, well, you got to bring the family in. So I brought his mother and father in and his little brother. And I noticed, and he just crossed the room and hit his little brother, this wild little kid. And everybody was thought, oh, he's terrible. And then, so I said to him, well, I noticed that I ask your parents a question, then you cross the room and hit your little brother. What's going on? And he said, well, if they talk, they'll get a divorce. And so family therapy had this way of, there's a kind of magic in that, and people would things that made no sense, but you could tell how in their world they made sense, and so that. But then I really realized I liked, and I really did a whole long process of working with my own dreams and things like that, and so I realized that there was a beauty in that, and it made your life more vivid. And then the images did. Basically, it's about images and Zen, the images of Zen and the images of our lives just, in a way, instruct us and change us and change our hearts. And so I didn't stay doing psychoanalysis, but I brought some of the methods in. I wasn't a clinician in the way that, I have friends who are psychiatrists or something. They just love that stuff. And I just wanted people to get awakened and transform their consciousness, I really appreciate what they did, but,
So that mission of awakening people, bringing people to the sense of nowness, really, really like identifying with their truest self. Obviously that led you down the path of becoming a published author, being a Zen teacher as well. You're talking about how you've obviously have an interest with literature going back to when you were a child. When did you start writing? What was the impetus behind that?
This is a kind of weird story, but I was working in the smelter in Tasmania, which people would run away to the smelter, and I ran away there in this mining town, and it was, and you could, in between there was a copper smelter, and they do, I don't know, 3 or 4 pours a night of copper, and in between, if you kept out of sight, if you're inside, people would give you something to do, usually repulsive, but if you kept out of sight, nobody would. And so I would hide, and then I started noticing how beautiful the copper pouring was, and I was reading, and then I was sort of reciting memorizing poems, and which is kind of, in a way, an interesting practice, The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze distance. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. Then it is not the thing that makes us happy or happy, unhappy. So that sort of thing. That was at Wallace Stevens' poem. But I'd be singing this to myself and working on a sledgehammer, and there'd be copper pouring, and we're breathing pretty pure sulfur dioxide. and it's a kind of crazy place, but it's sort of like straight out of Dante. But anyway, but I started writing there as a way of, trying to understand life. And I was touched by the people there because they were people, they were refugees from the Second World War, or people, God knows what they'd done in the Second World War, and you probably didn't want to ask, and people with strange tattoos being scrubbed off them and things, or people from a place like Czech, where they'd escaped the Russian domination or things like that. And so it was a kind of interesting, rough crew, but, and I I would go home and off shift and get some sleep and try and write about it, So I don't think the writing was very good, but it was an interesting way to approach it, I thought, And I was reading about mythology and things like that. They had a little public library that nobody went to, and so they're thrilled that one of the guys out of the mines and came into the library. So.
What I find very interesting and effective about your particular style of writing is that you take this ancient wisdom and you blend it with your own personal stories, and it's this very beautiful synthesis. It's really I think that's why your book, Bring Me the Rhinoceros, I think that's why it really was, it stuck with me, because it took some, instead of it being like a dry textbook in a sense, it was a living document, because you lived and breathed those experiences yourself, and you were able to translate that and make that wisdom more tangible. How did you formulate your style of writing, and why did you make a conscious decision to include your own experiences alongside this ancient wisdom?
That's a great question, and the answer is I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I was sort of listening to what came, and then I had this weird. You were talking about fate and how, sometimes a book comes to you and it's part of your fate or whatever it is. Like the Tibetans appeared in one of my friends who came to study with me said she kept dreaming of a rhinoceros. She's actually really well-known songwriter, but anyway, she kept dreaming of a rhinoceros, and she said, I don't know. And she was actually in a dream analysis with a well-known dream analyst and stuff, and at the time, and she couldn't. She just couldn't. She took it to a dream group and a dream analyst. I don't know what a rhinoceros is. It doesn't seem to be much for me. I just keep dreaming of it. And she was passing through LA, and then in the LA airport, there was this book that said "Bring Me the Rhinoceros." So she snatched it and took it on the plane, and she read it. And this is what my dream's about. And then she thought, well, this guy, I probably should look him up. And then I was living just down the road kind of thing, and had a little Zen group and stuff. And so you get that sort of stuff. Magic it's not really magic, but it's the current of life happens, and you've got to be willing. If you want to be wise, you have to be willing to listen to that sort of thing. Oh, this book touched my heart, or this image touched my heart. Like, did I know what I was doing? And the answer is no. And I also had an odd experience. Like I went to the National University to visit a friend, and later on I went and studied there, but I had no intention of studying that at the time. I went there to visit a friend, and his roommate was this really interesting young woman who was coming to and fro from Kyoto and translating Japanese poets. And she said, and I said, well, I don't know. I'm trying to write these poems, and they're just not very good, but I think I need some time. So I'm just going to go up north somewhere and find a place. And she said, "Oh, my mother has she's lonely. My dad just died. She'll appreciate some company and do some gardening." And her mother turned out to be this legend, famous Australian poet, And so, she didn't really mentor me, but somehow living in her life, which is full of poetry books and art by one of her famous artists and things like that, was sort of, she had a very deep mind, although she wasn't. And I say in Rhino, I say something like, at one time I said to her, "Well, I just wonder what it's all about. And how does the universe really work? And what are we doing here and stuff?" And she's typing away. And she had an old-fashioned typewriter where she liked to work. And she looks at me and says, "Oh, you need to go to India for that." And then looks back and keeps typing. It's like, it was a legitimate question, but it wasn't hers. And in fact, I think I didn't, in my India turns out to be Zen, but so. I tell that story in Rhino, I think. So, but it's a good question. How do the magic of our lives starts to carry us at a certain time?
Were there any other works of literature that really influenced you? I know you said I remember that story particularly in Rhino too. That stuck with me. I heard in that line too. You got to go to India for those answers. That's a good line right there.
She's great. She wasn't very into the magic of things. She was close to some. Also, she was very close to some First Peoples, and I met some kind of people who were working with the whole land rights issue and stuff through her, and who were also poets and stuff. And so she was a great influence on my life and a profound figure, but she wasn't actually interested in what I was interested in in other ways, So, but realizing there's a magic in the Odyssey, I read the Odyssey when I was kind of young because my grandfather used to tell sea stories, and he was a ship's captain with a tattoo he'd got in Marseille when he was 14 years old or something, and when he was just a cabin boy. And so there's that sort of storytelling, mythological environment around me when I grew up, even though my family was not, we were poor and a little bit crazy like a lot of colonial people,
Yeah, I can tell that story, the Odyssey in particular, is very influential to you because in your new book, the story of the Buddha, I know you in the very beginning in the introduction, you do mention that story as well. So that's obviously, and then I see that also at one point in Rhino, you do talk about the Odyssey as well.
And it's and I talk about the story. I did another book called The Light Inside the Dark, which is for some people very important, but it's about how the traumatic experiences of your life are a part of, the obstacles are gates, and there's a light inside the dark and stuff. And so that was a very different style of book from either of the other two books I've written. But in that I mentioned, the character in the Greek myth, Psyche, she has to go, she pisses off her mother-in-law and she falls in love with the god of love and pisses off her mother-in-law, and mother-in-law makes her count sort seeds, which is a great fairy tale thing, a big pile of tiny seeds, millet and vetch and things. And it's just something out of Grimm's fairy tales. But it's actually a Greek myth, and she has to do all these. And I thought, oh, that's the spiritual task. When you're in meditation, you've got to do these boring things, and you've got to shut up and not be important, and suffer from the boredom. And also, in the end, you get helped by forces larger than yourself. I suppose that's what it would be. But you have to do the suffering part of. I don't know if suffering is quite right, but if you're full of sorrow or suffering or don't like yourself, or some people don't like you, that's all right. That's part of the transformation process. It's like Jung talked about the alchemists in that way, and so that's a good metaphor. You're being heated and pressurized and all those things when you're having a really hard time, and so sometimes you'll meet people who had a really hard time, or I think in the Rhino I speak about Isan Dorsey, who's traveling drag queen under the name of Tommy Dorsey, who was kind of really, his life was too crazy, and he was too drunk and too mad and all that sort of thing. And he was just being pulled apart by his life in San Francisco in that era. And so he took up Zen. And as he said, he has a dress, but now it's black and it's a robe. and then he eventually died of AIDS, but he became a very wise person through having had this completely crazy, out of control life that even he didn't know what to do about himself. And then he became this wise, compassionate, Kuan Yin-like person. So started as Zen Center, which is still happening, and things like that. So you'll see, you're terrible, difficult, and then he died, and it was kind of, in a way, you could tell he'd done what he came for, and then he went and died of. This is long ago. He died of AIDS and stuff in the 90s. But so some people are made wiser by their difficulties. And you might be too. People might be too. We can say to your audience, you might be too. Don't blame yourself for your difficulties. That's one of the things. Be compassionate with yourself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. You were just talking about boredom before, suffering, boredom. In the 21st century now, this generation that's coming up, there's this talk of the death of boredom or the end of boredom. It seems like we're inundated with media 24/7. I mean, now we have these devices that are, right at arm's length away that we can just, if we're a little sensation of boredom, it's almost like a drug in a sense. You could just take the phone and you can spend hours and hours and just, basically piss your time away, So do you have concerns that in the generation that's coming up right now, that people aren't experiencing boredom, that they aren't taking that time, that those precious moments to sit back with themselves?
Well, you've still got to learn something, and you've still got to learn something you might not understand. And I remember sitting in grade school, and I'd get through the lesson really quickly, and then I'd just still be droning on for another hour, and stuff. And so it was sort of interesting to me. And eventually I got to be curious about myself. And so one of the things for people to be curious about is, why do I need to distract myself, and what am I distracting myself from? And it's kind of exciting, but it's sort of like there's an old Zen saying, it's like eating painted cake, and because it's not really nourishing necessarily. And so, but we'll see, people, these things always work themselves out in a culture, I think, because at the moment we're incredibly ADD, the whole culture. But there's, so, in meditation, then you pay attention to what's there. And so you pay attention to, if you notice, oh, my mind's full of this, well, I can say stop doing that, and that's okay. But I notice that, I have a lot of friends who are not neurotypical, and so their minds are doing these amazing but like intense things. And I suppose my mind wants to do amazing, intense things. So, and then if you just start noticing, what is it like to be doing that? So that's always the question. What is it like to be on my iPhone, or what is it like? And so I get quite a few people out of, obviously I live in Northern California, I get a lot of tech people. So not hard to find a tech person. So yeah, one of my friends did this great thing. He said, he just loves coding, and he loves programming, and he's got a company and so on. At some stage he had to stop coding, and now AI has taken that away. He doesn't need to do that. He just tells the AI what to code. He's got to line it up properly, but then the AI will do all the coding much quicker. And then he said to me this great thing. When he first came to me, he read Rhino. I don't know if it was Rhino he read something of mine, and he was really interested in what he said. I said this thing about not knowing could be really good. If you don't know and you relax into your not knowing, you don't have to disapprove of your not knowing. And he said he thought there was something interesting there. He wanted to go into places that not only didn't know, but he didn't know that he didn't know about, that sort of thing. So in other words, a new territory in the soul, we might say. And so he did that. And then this is the first line he writes me. He says, so my nephew needed a kidney, and my nephew needed a kidney, and then they told me I was a match, but they didn't tell him because they wanted to give me the chance of saying I wasn't going to donate a kidney. And he said, and I thought, I really like it. It's my workout program get interrupted, and I'll only have one kidney and all this stuff. And he didn't know his nephew really at all, or very well. And so I thought, but I wanted to step into this place I didn't know about. And so 5 weeks post-operation, he said, and so he donated the kidney, and now he's on the board of my community now, and he's got a, software company. But you can tell he's learned how to stop. You've got to really concentrate. You need to also be free and not be distracted all the time. I think there's a kind of, you just respect your mind is not to try to get away from it, but I'm wanting to get on my iPhone now. Do I want to get on my iPhone really? And that sort of thing. And then sometimes just it's not the greatest sin in the world if you do. But also, what does your life taste like when you're on your phone all the time? And a whole lot of people say, well, it feels like an addiction and I hate it, And so, yeah. But, this is what our time is.
It kind of reminds me of, I believe it's in Taoism, the idea that when the Tao disappears, that's when it will reappear, it will reemerge. I'm sure that with these truths that are found within Zen and all over, all different global traditions, no matter what, nothing can come between the truth and our desire to actually reach for the truth and to experience it. I think one of the beautiful things about Zen in particular is the idea that it doesn't give you any definitive answers necessarily. It's more so the practice, right? Where it's kind of just showing you a way to live authentically rather than telling you, like the Abrahamic religions where this is the truth, this is what it is, it's undeniable, you have to follow this. With Zen, it's more of that practice and, experimentation as well. I mean, I think that's a beautiful thing about Zen.
Yeah, I think it's allergic to telling you what to think and feel. It's not even allergic; it just doesn't have any interest in that. And also the wild irrationality of the Tibetans are Zen, like very similar in some ways, the Tibetan tradition. But I have a Tibetan friend who's like famous reincarnated Lama type person, and which he's less impressed with than other people are. But anyway, and he said, what is Buddha? 3 pounds of flax. What does that mean? So that was he called me up like, what does that mean? And he ended up going to Japan to study with some Roshi there a little bit or something. But he, and because you're realizing that my questions might not be formulated in the deepest possible way, And so it's a nice thing to, what am I asking? And so in Zen, there's that whole thing about famous koan, young guys wandering around visiting teachers, which is a sensible thing to do. And when he comes to an old teacher and asks all his questions, the teacher does his best. And he says, well, what are you doing? And the kid says, well, I'm just wandering about, visiting teachers. I'm wandering about on pilgrimage. And the teacher says, well, why are you doing that? And he said, well, I don't know. When I think about it, I don't know. And the teacher says, not knowing is most intimate. And so that takes us, and that was a big awakening moment for the kid. And the kid said, okay, now I'll leave. And the teacher said, not so fast. And the kid stayed there 10 years and became a famous teacher himself. But yeah, so that thing about if you don't know something, being like the great matters, like what do I really think about death? The great matters, you've got to be in, there's an intimacy when you stop trying to say, well, death, you're going to, whatever it is, get reborn or see your angel or whatever it is, see your all that stuff, or nothing happens when you die, don't you know? Are you stupid? Those, none of those answers are very interesting, but the not knowing is interesting. And the mystery, being in the mystery,
So what's it like being a Zen teacher in the 21st century right now, actually in the 21st century? Like how has your teaching evolved as the years have gone on? How is it, you talk about being kind of close to that Silicon Valley area. What is it like being a teacher right now in this particular time in history?
Well, the nice thing about being being a teacher is that, I feel it's a kind of modest occupation, that all these people are running around and getting amazingly rich all around me. And increasingly I meet people, no, I don't work. I don't need to work. That sort of thing. I can start a company. I might start another company or something like that. And there's something about, then I taste my own life. I work in the garden. I talk to people. What does it really like to be with Joe here? And it's kind of interesting. So I feel like, rather than just answering your questions, what is it like to be with you? And what's the field like? And things like, what does my heart feel about being here? And there's a kind of tenderness in just being with you. And like, how are you? I know you have a real quest that you're really interested in. And it's always nice to see that, and you're not trying to tell me what to think. And I like that, And so there's a certain, that's what intimacy is, I think. And we're intimate with life, whether it's breakfast or our lover or our kid or whatever it is, That way we're not, the whole thing is Zen is famous for you. You don't have to be afraid when someone's dying. You can accompany them. Don't tell them go for the light. You don't know what their experience is going to be like. Let them have their experience and like that. So there's that sort of, it's kind of sweet. And so it's wonderful to be alive, but you can't rely on it because, First Noble Truth says you're going to die. But there's nothing to object to about that, since that which is true, we don't have to object to. So that's what being a Zen teacher.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah. So, John, we're getting close to the end of our podcast episode here. I want to thank you again. I appreciate your time, but I got one question I want to ask, and it's a little bit of an easier one. I don't know. We'll see. Can you explain to me what is meditation?
There's a great koan that goes, what is meditation? And the teacher says, not meditation. And the student says, why not? And he says, it's alive. It's alive. So that's meditation. And, if you want a more technical answer, that's the deepest answer. But if you want a more technical answer, I'd say it usually helps to sit down, although you can do it walking or you can do it whatever, but don't try to achieve things and try to be patient with everything that appears in your mind and your heart, and don't think the wrong things going on. Then gradually your mind, you'll notice if you just, give half an hour to that, you'll find that every day or an hour, then you'll find that you don't object to your mind so much. It's not so tangled. You're not so anxious. Anxiety is really thinking. Suffering is thinking, this isn't it. But in meditation, this is it. So it's all right if I'm in pain or dying or something difficult is happening. It's all right. And so, yeah, it's a kind of cool thing. And so, can I give a plug for our website? Is pacificzen.org.
Please, yeah, and definitely. And your new book, too, that just came out, the story of the Buddha as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So we we're just wandering along, like really enjoying our lives, trying to share that with other people and stuff like that. And there's a whole crew of people doing that with me. And I kind of like being in a community doing it. That's the other thing. So that's why it's nice actually to come on a podcast and talk to you, because don't know. Then suddenly we're part of each other's community. So.
That's right, definitely. Yeah. I'm glad to be a part of your community. Yeah. So, John, what are a few things that bring you joy and peace in life?
Really being with someone I love and just like, oh, what's going on? You just stop everything. So it's a kind of meditation. Intimacy is a kind of meditation where you just, oh, what's it like being here? What am I feeling? What are you feeling? That kind of thing. And that gives me joy. I have not everybody has a garden, but I have a garden and I sort of just be there, and I have wild foxes come by and look in the window asking for dates, and I'm sort of with them, and they understand a lot. Animals and birds, I meditate outside, animals and birds, their behavior changes and they get interested in you when they can feel when your mind's noisy, and when it calms down, they're hip to that, and so things like that. So, but I don't know, love is the biggest thing that brings people joy, I think. And so even if it's just sitting alone in the garden, it's a kind of love of the universe. Yeah.
That's great. Well, John, I want to thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. This is a great introspective conversation. I'm definitely going to be thinking a lot about all these concepts that we spoke about today. Yeah, it really means a lot. So I want to thank you for your time.
I'm delighted to meet you, Joe. So thank you.